Hi, everyone, and welcome to our third module. Here we'll take a little bit more of a macro level view of innovation, talk a little bit about government regulation, monopolies, modularity, and platform ecosystems. Our first section is gonna discuss standard battles. All of us have kind of seen industry standards kind of form and develop. We're usually not actively involved. Maybe some of you through your employment or companies, you've experienced kind of the discussion around industry standards and how they emerge and how, as a result, we will get dominant designs. Generally speaking, right, this is a technology class, and in technology, we have a lot of pressure for standardization, right? Companies gonna fight about which standards they're gonna adopt. Think about VHS versus beta, which is was a big standard battle for video recorders or video players. We had MPEG, we had Blu-ray, all these standards, right? Whenever we had audio, visual, entertainment options, we had quite a few technology standard battles. You see a lot of that also in terms of cables and connections. You probably just heard that the EU forced Apple to use USB-C on all of their devices. So we see there's kind of an ongoing debate and battle around these. That is shaped by a whole different set of factors relevant to us in terms of your project and kind of understanding technology commercialization. Is that in the process of commercializing your technology, sometimes you are at the forefront of developing a new standard, right? And so then you have to think a little bit about what does that mean? How do I position myself? What kind of other partnerships, since we talked about collaboration strategies in the previous module, how do I kind of navigate my way around these things? We take an example here, which is mobile payments, right? All of us have done some sort of mobile payment in some form or shape. The cool thing about that, right? Obviously, there's a lot of utility for firms and customers to do it. It's faster, it's instantaneous. You can track everything on your smartphone, right? Apple Pay is a great example. And we've seen technology companies such as Apple kind of move into these different markets, right? They're trying to take more and more of the value chain. And mobile payments is a big one, right? I mean, you have essentially direct contact with the customer. You can offer all kinds of financing options to the customer, and you keep the customer on your platform, which is very important. Now we have a variety of actors: credit card companies, banks, consumers, big and small businesses, and of course the big tech companies who kind of are very present in the space. There were a couple of technological standards. There is something called near-field communication, and we've seen that used by Apple, Samsung, and other large companies. We have Square and PayPal, who don't require an NFC chip, but just a web application. And we have other companies like Walmart, Old Navy, Best Buy, 7-Eleven, who use what's called currency. Okay, so we have all these different mobile payments. In developing economies, we have a system called M-Pesa. That's actually pretty cool. I will add that as an optional reading. Fascinating, right? How they built that in countries that didn't have a lot of that infrastructure, is essentially working with mobile phones, and through texts, you can actually verify and execute financial transactions. Really interesting system. For us, most of it, since we have the smartphone infrastructure, we're trying to run this through NFC, web applications, or currency. Now, generally speaking, we have a bunch of forces or concepts that are important when we think about standard battles, but also will apply to general discussions around innovation, technology, commercialization, etc. We have what's called network externalities. We have a concept called absorptive capacity, install base, learning effects, complementary goods, rate of adoption. We talked a little bit about rate of adoption. We're gonna regurgitate some of this stuff here to kind of put it into a bit more of a perspective. All of you, learning curve is a pretty common terminology. Economies of scale, we talked a little bit about. The idea here is there is for every technology, right, that we put out there, whether it's Facebook, whether it's cars, whether it's payment systems, whether it's, you know, anything you can imagine, there is all kinds of learning curves associated, right? The firm learns how the technology is used, the customer learn how the technology is best applied for their needs. And so as people, right, the faster all these different actors learn or can adjust to that technology, the easier it is to get adopted. Now, when we think about absorptive capacity, and I'll talk about that, right? So we're thinking about learning curves and generally integrating knowledge into kind of developing technologies on a firm level. You can imagine that every firm, we talked about technology firms like Facebook, we talked about Apple, right? They build a knowledge infrastructure, right? So a knowledge base in their company. And they use this knowledge base to essentially try to continue to develop innovations or develop kind of further develop their technologies. There's a couple of problems with that, right? So the good thing is accumulating a knowledge base kind of helps you build expertise, kind of helps you bring more relevant problem solving skills to the table. One of the problems is, however, is that you also have put yourself in a little bit of a limitation, right? Your knowledge base, we talked a little bit about creativity in module 2. What happens is the stronger your knowledge base becomes, right, the more rigid, in many cases, the more rigid your innovation horizon becomes as well, right? And so one of the key concepts here is what's called an absorptive capacity, right? So the ability of a firm to recognize the value of information, assimilate it, and apply it to commercial ends, right? And I don't expect you to know everything on this diagram, but what it essentially just shows is firms need to process knowledge, information, and need to use it to commercial ends. And how can they do it? Well, they can develop new technologies, right? So they can take what the customer tells them and develop something completely new. They can use that information and refine what's already out there. They can make decisions about which technologies should they purchase, right? And which technologies they should develop and how those actually intermesh. But also the question of how do I develop capabilities of analyzing outside knowledge? And we discussed this concept when we talked about open innovation, right? So open innovation talked essentially about absorptive capacity, right? That's one of the capabilities that help firms become more successful open innovators. Now, another concept, what we call network externalities, and that just simply means that the using of a good increases with a number of users of the same good, right? So think about Facebook, and we can make a point for and against that, the utility part. But the more people you know are on Facebook, right, the more useful Facebook becomes to you, right? And we can think about that with pretty much many other network technologies, right? So for example, think about iMessage, right? If you know a lot of other iPhone users, you can essentially use FaceTime or you can use iMessage and you don't have to pay for messaging, right? So that is the network externality, means essentially more users that do the same thing or use the same good, the utility increases. Now, there are some exceptions to that logic, right? And we can, we don't only have to think about that in a digital world, although that's a very typical example. Think about railroads, right? So the denser that network becomes, the more people use railroads, the more likely it is that there's going to be more routes to different places. At the same time, if there's too many people using the same train, right, or too many people using the same gym, your utility decreases a little bit as a customer, right? So if you go to a gym and it's full, you're not going to be able to get, you're not going to be able to have enough time to do your exercise, or you have to wait a long time, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so this is kind of the idea of network externalities, and that's a really key theme in kind of the digital businesses, right? Platform ecosystems, all kinds of web applications, right? Where you need a certain mass of people. Think about PayPal or eBay, right? If you don't have, or what's also called these two-sided business models, right? If you don't have enough customers, you're not going to have enough merchants. And if you don't have enough merchants, you're not going to get enough customers, right? So the idea of networks and mass, critical mass, to kind of justify that business. Okay. We talked, right, about adoption curves and reason why people might adopt the technology. Similarly, right, the idea here is dominant designs, right? And we can think about dominant designs from a variety perspective, but let's say we use the example of VHS. That was the video player standard. I don't know how many of you have ever kind of used a video recorder or player, maybe a few of you. But the idea is, right, if you don't have enough users using that particular video recorder standard, that video recorder standard will kind of die off, right? And so the idea is you need to have enough network externality, right? Which means essentially you have to have a large installed base. You also need complementary goods, right? It's no good if you have the Apple ecosystem if there are no developers developing for Apple, for iOS, right? So that's a pretty good example. And so thinking about this is essentially becomes a self-reinforcing cycle, right? You don't have enough developers, meaning you don't have enough applications. If you don't have enough applications, you're not going to have enough customers. And if you don't have enough customers, nobody's going to want to develop for that platform. Operating systems, right? We've seen operating system before Android, the most commonly, still pretty dominantly used in desktops is Microsoft, right? And they have been in business. They have been the dominant operating system for desktops. In fact, for desktops, they still are next to macOS, starting in the 80s, right? They were incredibly dominant. They kind of pivoted a little bit now. They're doing, so they're selling devices as well as doing cloud computing and offering kind of services to companies. But what we've seen is that they've essentially missed the train for mobile devices, right? All the vast majority, if not all, are either Android or they're macOS, right? Android is more of a open source system that many different companies use. macOS is typically for Mac devices, right? And so Microsoft has recovered a little bit. They have the Surface. They have some other cool devices. I don't know who here remembers the Zune, which was kind of was supposed to be the iPod killer that didn't quite pan out as they thought it would. But Microsoft is a good example for how market leaders who kind of dominate the space can also kind of miss the boat on some of these developments. And this is kind of the first point is really important, right? So when you commercialize technology, you really have to figure out whether customers or users get utility from it, right? In most cases, technologies improve faster than customer requirements demand, right? And we've seen this, there is we've seen all this discussion about the iPhone 14, right? Whether people really need the iPhone 14, since these different versions of iPhones have been kind of relatively similar um, with some minor changes. But you have to kind of pace your innovation, right? If you don't want to go too far ahead, if customers or consumers are not ready yet for that, there will not be a lot of commercial potential, right? And so you might spend a lot of money on something that might not have yet a lot of applications or interest. Currently, right, there's a huge discussion about the metaverse. I don't know if you noticed that today. Facebook published their numbers. The analysts didn't quite appreciate it, and we saw nearly 20% decline on their stock because people keep telling them, hey, the metaverse isn't here yet. You're spending a lot of money on it now. When are you going to be able to monetize it, right? So that's a huge debate, and we'll see how that's going to pan out, and whether, Facebook was a little too early in that area. Lots of reasons why dominant designs are selected. We talked about kind of the self-reinforcing cycle. There's also kind of some government/regulatory issues here in the US. And again, I don't know if you remember that in the 80s, there were a couple of different standards in terms of TVs. So in the US, it was NTSC. I think Japan also had NTSC. I think the UK had a different standard, and then Europe had PAL. Similarly, we have different kind of wireless standards, GSM in the European Union, and you have a bunch of different standards in the US. So that happens and depends a little bit on how essential that technology is for kind of infrastructure and general operations of in these particular countries. Sometimes, and that doesn't happen very often, is you have what's called a natural monopoly. So it might make sense if we want to have a natural monopoly, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, because the investments to build this technology are so large that the government essentially says, okay, if you're going to invest all this in infrastructure, then we allow you to kind of monopolize that space. We've seen some of these monopolies being broken up in the past. Standard Oil is a good example. They've done a lot of infrastructure work. They kind of merged the oil exploration and distribution space, and eventually were broken up because government said that they are misusing their monopolies. Similar discussions are currently happening for big tech, and whether Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, Google, for example, have some sort of monopoly that they misuse and need potentially to be broken up. Again, when we think about why dominant designs selected or emerge, is that they often have far-reaching influence, right? So when we think about the TV standards, NTSC, PAL, or the mobile phone standards, those are still in place, right? So they were, I think, put in place, I want to say 25 years ago, 30 years ago, and they are still operating, right? And so being able to establish a technology standard and kind of come up with a dominant design is important. However, when we talk about winner-take-all markets, and we'll provide more details as we go along, the idea is there is technological, and that's not only for winner-take-all markets, but generally speaking, technologically superior products do not always win, right? And that, again, has multiple reasons, adoption reasons, whether the technology is easy to use, right? And what actually technologically superior means. But often what we've seen is that the firms that have created dominant designs can maintain their advantage for quite a little while. And obviously, there's a strong connection with technology S-curves, right? So there's a strong connection with adoption. Typically, right, dominant designs will be challenged on a constant basis, right? But the question is, how do competitive products or services, how do they manage their adoption cycle, right? And can they actually move from the early adopter stage or the innovator stage to the mass market, which is one of the big challenges of kind of establishing your technology. Again, whether dominant designs will be replaced really depends on the technological discontinuity, right? Microsoft Windows could not carry its desktop dominance into the mobile phone market because they weren't really mobile phone innovator, or mobile phone pioneers, right? Apple pioneered the smartphone. Google and Samsung, they kind of followed Google mostly with their operating system and or helping kind of to build the open access Android system. Samsung similarly using that, and Apple using their Mac OS. Essentially, Windows kind of losing out in that battle. We have kind of a similar discussion. Well, not exactly the same thing, but we've seen kind of gasoline-powered engines being replaced by electric vehicles, right? Where the dominant design is the gas-powered engine. And we've seen, Tesla and Toyota with its hybrid Prius and Tesla with its full electric vehicle, kind of innovating in that space and bringing that discontinuity in the market. And now we've seen a lot of these big car manufacturers kind of trying to follow that path and offer electric vehicles. So whether a dominant design carries the market share really depends a little bit on what other competing technologies will come into play. Typically, right, so once a dominant design, and again, dominant designs, let's say we use the example of the iPhone, right, or the equivalent Samsung phone. BlackBerry, I don't know if you guys remember BlackBerry, but they used to be the dominant kind of smartphone provider, and the Apple iPhone kind of took away the vast majority of the market share together with Samsung. And so once you're kind of established a dominant design, you're typically invest to defend that, right? So to kind of offer incremental changes so that your dominant design kind of stays there and you keep your market power. We see that with iPhone, and we see that with Samsung's smartphones that provide these incremental changes versus the first iPhone was definitely the first couple of iPhones were big changes compared to the BlackBerry. Again, don't get too hung up about the S-curve. S-curves can be useful, right? They typically, when we look at macro data, you know, when I see kind of adoption curves and I see why certain actors in that network adopt a particular technology. So as the real-time data kind of evolves, I could kind of start thinking whether I cross a certain threshold, right, which is important. But typically S-curves are macro tools, right? And a lot of that has to, you know, we're looking at, we kind of trying to project the future, we're looking at the past, and that's not always incredibly effective, right? So S-curves are really cool when you have the complete data set, right? And you kind of look back and say, oh, okay, so looking at these adoption curves, that's how these technologies behaved. But if you're a firm and you're trying to look forward, there's actually better ways to kind of think and predict and forecast kind of your technology. All right, so that finishes the first section of module 3. In the next section, we will be talking about the value of technology.